In 2009, my parents received a call that changed my family's life forever. For several days, my sister had been telling us about the wonderful things going on in her life. She was getting great grades, job offers, and she'd even picked her art back up again. But in direct contradiction to this, my parents received a call from her then boyfriend, and he said, "I don't mean to bother you guys, but your daughter's not doing well, and I think that she needs help." What we thought was my sister's success was actually the result of a manic episode. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. In the weeks that followed, my parents spent a lot of time going back and forth between my hometown in Texas and Washington, D.C., where my sister was studying. For several weeks, my sister had been struggling with fairly serious delusions. She was convinced that she was running for president, or that my dad was a drug cartel lord, or that my mom suffered from battered wife syndrome, obviously none of which were true. Because I was a young teenager at the time, it's easy to attribute to my young age that I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know how to help. But the reality is that people of all ages feel this way when a loved one is diagnosed with a mental illness. Traditionally, when we talk about mental health, we focus on the barriers to getting help. However, I'd like to talk about a different side of mental health, the barriers to giving help. I want to talk about people like me and my family when my sister was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My goal is to give you a different perspective on mental health, normalize the barriers of giving help, and ultimately leave you feeling more confident when it comes to helping people in need. Everything that I talk about today is going to be focused around what I've learned when it comes to mental illness, namely that recovery isn't black and white. It's not simply that either you're getting better or you're getting worse. The reality is that there's a spectrum of recovery that comes with different stages. In public health, there's actually a behavior change framework that captures this, called the trans-theoretical model. And while I'd love to spend the entire talk talking about this model, I'm only going to focus on three main stages: pre-contemplation, action, and maintenance. Pre-contemplation is when a person doesn't think they have a problem or they don't want to change. So in mental illness, this might look like someone who's sick, but they don't want to get help. The action stage is when they're taking active steps to improve their mental health. So that could be by going to therapy, trying medications, or any other means. The maintenance stage is when you take steps to maintain the benefits that you got from the action stage. It's important to know that these different stages aren't discrete, and generally people move throughout them in their behavior change journey. More importantly, these different stages come with different barriers. In the case of my sister, my family had to help her move through the entire process of recovery. When my parents received that call, it was the first time ever that my sister had dealt with bipolar disorder. And the fact of the matter is that mania feels really good, so my sister didn't want to change. The only solution to get her to start recovering was for her to be hospitalized. So it was after this that I could start helping her, and I can attest to the fact that depending on where she was in her recovery, I experienced different barriers. At first, we focused a lot on simply getting her to take her medication, but later, we dealt with more complex issues, such as the fact that our family dynamics had changed simply because of her diagnosis. The experiences with my sister was the first time that I'd ever been personally and deeply impacted by mental illness. Since then, I've started to think about mental health recovery as a spectrum with different stages, and it's helped me in other instances when loved ones have been impacted by mental illness. When I was 16, my then boyfriend was arrested on account of a fairly serious crime. And given the sensitive ages of high school, I wasn't allowed to see him until I turned 18. During that time, he developed fairly serious depression with suicidal ideation. And because of mutual family friends, I was actually aware of this. So before I saw him, I prepared myself to deal with someone with serious depression. But more accurately, I prepared myself to deal with what I thought it would look like. What I didn't expect was how normal for it to look. So many of our first and subsequent interactions were almost unsettlingly normal, because in so many ways, Jose was still Jose. And despite this normalcy, eventually, the dark thoughts of depression and suicide bled through. I quickly realized that a lot of his life was put on hold waiting for me. And he didn't want to move forward, and he didn't want to move on. And I think he even put on hold his suicide. When we met together again, he would tell me a lot of the details of how he would do it and how often he thought about it. And whether or not he intended to place this burden on me, he told me, "This is what I think about when you're not around, and I don't know what I'd do without you, and I don't have a future." That's really heavy for an 18-year-old to be dealing with. And unlike my sister, who had begun moving through the stages of recovery, Jose didn't think there was a problem with the way that he was thinking. So the biggest barrier that I experienced was learning to help someone who didn't want to help themselves. At this point, I'd like to make clear that a diagnosis doesn't necessarily determine the barriers that you'll experience. So I'd like to talk about another story of mine. One of my close friends, like many people, suffers from anxiety and, like Jose, depression. And if you met her today, you wouldn't even notice. She's one of the funniest, most hardworking and ambitious people that I've ever met. And while I can attest to the fact that she's always been this way, I can also attest to the fact that her journey with depression and anxiety has been a challenging one. Growing up, Lucy and I used to tell each other everything. So it wasn't until many years into our relationship when she suddenly told me, "We need to talk." So it was in her bedroom, on her bed, when she started telling me about the kinds of things that she thought about. And at the time, I couldn't help but think, I already know this. We're best friends. The whole point is that we think alike. But it was through tears that she started telling me the reality of her thoughts. She told me, "Do you ever just drive a car and think about veering it off the road? Or do you ever look at your parents' pills and just think about taking all of them?" And I realized that I don't think like that. In fact, in this moment, when it was my role to make her feel better, I vividly remembered that she asked me if I was okay, because despite the depression and anxiety, Lucy was still Lucy. In the year that followed, me and a handful of other friends were around to see her start treatment, start college, and get to the point where depression and anxiety no longer ruled her life. But in the same way that I got to see her recover, I was also around to see her relapse. And that's where the barriers began. When someone has a history of anxiety and depression, the line between healthy stress and pathological distress becomes blurred. So the biggest challenge I faced was learning to recognize the signs of relapse and figuring out when it was appropriate for me to step in. Each of these different experiences impacted me in different ways. With my sister, my family and I were going through something that not a lot of people have experienced. In the case of Jose and Lucy, despite the fact that they had the same diagnosis, it's clear that it looked different and that the help that they needed was different. Depending on where they each were in the journey to recovery, the barriers that I faced were different. With my sister, my family ultimately had to focus a lot on relapse and getting her to work through the different stages all over again. And we had to learn to be patient and to come to terms with the fact that sometimes there's a limit to how much you can help. With Jose, I struggled to learn how to help someone who didn't want to help themselves. And with Lucy, I had to learn to recognize these signs of relapse and figure out when it was time to step in. In the same way that these different stages come with different barriers, I've also come to learn that they come with different solutions. For someone who's in the pre-contemplation stage, I've learned that the best and only thing that you can do is be there to weigh out the pros and cons so that the pros of getting help outweigh the cons. And depending on you and your loved one, you can do this in different ways, be it through conversation, through books, or by providing online resources. In the action stage, this is what people most traditionally think about when it comes to helping mental illness. And it's things like improved diet, improved exercise, and meditation and mindfulness skills. And what's important is that you can suggest these things and be there to join them in these activities. Additionally, you can provide self-care tips for when they start to experience setbacks in their treatment. You can ultimately be there to tell them that it's okay to not be okay. The maintenance stage, though it is the end goal of recovery, you can still be there to help by maintaining vigilance, learning the signs of relapse, and opening a healthy line of communication so that you can step in if you need to. Altogether, I hope that my experiences and talking about the different spectrum of recovery has given you an idea of how to help with mental illness. In my case, I've used the trans-theoretical model to conceptualize this. And while you can too, it doesn't have to serve as a step-by-step guide. There's a common theme to everything that I've talked about today, and that's education. Something that everyone in here can do is educate themselves on their loved one and their condition. Sure, it's easy to provide pros and cons like I mentioned in the pre-contemplation stage, but you can provide the best, most holistic advice if you're better informed on their condition. In the action stage, you can suggest different activities, but you can suggest the most productive ones if you best know your loved one and their condition. Altogether, I really do hope that these experiences have given you a different perspective of mental health, and I hope that moving forward you can feel more confident in helping people in need. Thank you.